Well, howdy, everybody, and welcome back in. This is Dave with the Believe podcast. Apologies, I took a few weeks off here. I went and visited family back on the East Coast, the home state of New Jersey. Checked in with my folks and a couple other family members. But I am back at it, and I know you've been waiting for it, so here we go, back into and diving headfirst into the Ten Commandments again. We are going into the Third Commandment today, which is to remember to keep holy the Lord's Day, and what that means. So I've already done the first and second commandments. If you haven't taken a look or a listen, I should say, because it's a podcast, head on back and take a listen to those. And as I always like to do, and I remind you guys at the top and bottom of each of the episodes here, please, please, please let me get your comments and thoughts on, it doesn't necessarily have to be related to this episode, but just in general, any of the other episodes that you might have heard in the past. I don't even know what number we're on now, but send in your comments. I'm over on YouTube and Spotify. Those are the only platforms that really dedicate themselves to, comment feedback section. I'm also on Apple Podcasts, but they only have like a review section. So please head on over to one of those two platforms and drop your comments. I really need those to get some feedback from the community and from you guys here. So please head on over and drop a comment there. But this one today is all about keeping the Lord's Day or keeping the Sabbath holy. And what does that mean, right? I have three main bullet points I'm going to talk about tonight. So let's just dive right into it here. Now, the first one is probably what you're thinking of and what a lot of people think of when you think of, keeping the Lord's Day holy or keeping the Sabbath holy, which is going to church. Does it always mean that, like, you have to, and if you miss a day of church, then that's a sin kind of thing? No, I don't really buy into that, but if you can, and, if you're physically able to and whatnot, try to head over to your local parish or church and catch that. Sometimes, growing up too, I call it the, what do they call it? I don't know if they call it the Saturday Vigil, but the Saturday night mass, if you can't make it on Sunday, if you're doing something else, which kind of contradicts the rest of what I'm going to be talking about today. But sometimes, your schedule might not allow it, so you might want to consider going on Saturday night instead of Sunday. Same vibe, right? Same kind of deal. But, if you're not physically able to, maybe, you have some sort of handicap or physical limitation, you can't head on over to your local church. A lot of churches now are more high tech and they are doing what they call live streams of the masses. And I will catch those from my local parish as well if I'm not able to make it in person. So I think the big thing here, the big draw that I'm trying to get to here is the presence, right? And trying to put yourself into that mindset of trying to attend a mass or trying to be more into that religious line of thinking, right? And trying to put yourself into that mindset. Okay, and it's the whole idea of like worship and prayer and trying to connect more closely with your faith. And that's primarily for, Christians and Catholics. I think for the Jewish folks out there, I think it runs the Sabbath is more of like a Friday night to Saturday night kind of thing. Here is your Hollywood reference here. If you ever saw The Big Lebowski, Walter Sobchak screaming Shomer Shabbos and keeping Saturdays to basically doing nothing and keeping it holy kind of thing. So yeah, that's primarily like the first bullet point here, and what I wanted to mention. Us Catholics like to think of the seventh day from the Lord as being like the day of rest. He created the entire world and everything in it, right, for the first 6 days, and jammed out on creation for the most part, and then the seventh day took that day to rest, kind of thing. So that's what that kind of means for that bullet point. That leads into this second bullet point, which is really about resting on that Sabbath day and saying, beyond the religious aspect of it and putting yourself into that mindset, maybe going to church and trying to connect more, with your faith and with God. It's also about really resting on that day. It's not only aligning your spirituality and your morals and everything and trying to reset, right? And I've talked about this on previous episodes as well, where this idea of, getting that reset button and getting ready for a new work week kind of thing, trying to cleanse yourself a little bit here, and just de-stress, detoxify kind of thing, more from like an emotional standpoint rather than a physical, and getting yourself mentally attuned and ready for another week ahead. But the second bullet point here of like taking the day for rest, I think is supremely important. And let's just talk about what the work week kind of looks like for us here, especially as Americans or here in America. We have one of the roughest work week schedules, I think, out of anybody in the world. We also have one of the most stringent, time off schedules. You're looking at like maternity leave and stuff like that. I think in Europe it's like almost a year or something like that, and we only get here, I think. I forget what the women get now. Geez, I don't even know. I think it might be like 3 months, or maybe a little bit longer. I know the guys only get 6 weeks, so that's only a month and a half. But it really pales in comparison to a lot of other countries out there. So we are definitely overtaxed, overworked, and you're talking about like a standard work week for Americans. You're usually looking at what they call a 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, which is 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., and then Monday through Friday, so 5 days a week. So if you're looking at it, the only days off that you get during a standard work week is Saturday and Sunday. And if we're talking about keeping the Sabbath holy and trying to do next to little or nothing as much as you can for that day of rest. Talking about like a mental, physical, as well, like a renewal kind of thing of, like I said, resetting your spirituality, your mind, and also your body here, then that really only leaves one additional day off that you have, which is Saturday, for literally everything else. If you have a young family at home, if you got kids and kids activities, there's a never-ending list of stuff that you can do around the house. You've got this room to paint, you've got this appliance to look at, you've got this board to fix, or whatever. You got Christmas decorations to put away, or something else to put up. The list never ends. Yard work, whatever. I mean, there's a ton of things, and it never seems to end. And that's kind of the problem that we get into, especially as Americans, is that we just don't have enough time. There's just not enough time to do other stuff outside of work. We're so exhausted from the work week and that 40-hour grind that we look towards the weekend and we go, I only have 48 hours to do literally everything else, unless I try to cram it in after work hours during the work week, which is even more stressful and everything, and grinds on you even more physically. Then we only really have 48 hours. So we really fall into this trap, especially I would say within the last, 75 years or so. Let's wind the clocks back to about the 1950s or 60s. And, I think the last generation to kind of do like a Sunday dinner. Oh man, I wanted to save that for my last bullet point here. I'm going to do that. So sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit, but I think a few generations back, they still kind of understood this idea of like a day of rest and really got it. But I think within the last, probably a little bit less than that, maybe the last 50 or 60 or so years or so, now we've really kind of done away with that. And that's not to say that like we've eliminated religion in our lives, but I think that idea of like that day of rest has really kind of gone by the wayside in a lot of ways as we've become a lot more in tuned and focused on being a capitalist society, and the almighty dollar kind of reigning supreme in our lives, and that's really unfortunate. So really getting back to, and this is my personal side note here. Me and the wifey here have decided and really tried to be on the same page here in 2026 to really get back to this whole idea of the day of rest, and taking at least one day to just kind of unwind, sit on the couch, sleep in super late, right, and try to just have a lazy day. And I gotta tell you, it really does do wonders. We've been trying to stick to it, and we have stuck to it for the most part so far. I mean, we're not too far into the year. We're only like 2.5 months into the year so far, but I gotta say, I'm really enjoying it, and I think my wife is as well. So the other bullet point here under number 2 here for the day of rest is they mention freedom from commercialism serves as a reminder that human dignity is not tied to productivity or economic output. In my notes of this one thing that I'm reading here. Now, I don't know how much of that we do. I like to do backpacking on the side as well and trying to connect more so with nature, which definitely is more of a disconnect from, your phones and screens and tablets and all that other kind of stuff. I don't know how much disconnect we're doing from commercialism when we're just sitting on the couch or probably still, looking at our phones or watching TVs, looking at ads and maybe doing some online shopping or whatever. But I think the idea there is to physically remove yourself, even though you may not be doing that from an online perspective. But again, it's that idea of like trying to, again, reset and disconnect from that as best as possible. All right. Third bullet point here. We're cruising right along. And this is the one that I kind of jumped into a little bit early on that second bullet point. Again, let's wind the clock back. Let's wind the clock back. Sorry, to the 1950s or 60s or so. And I really want to look at my grandparents' generation here. So I was born in the late 80s, and I really want to say that like my parents' generation, which is the boomer generation, was really like the last generation. I could be wrong here. Maybe there are probably certain sectors and certain families and certain cultures that still do this, but definitely in the Italian American viewpoint or standpoint, and in my particular instance, again, I can't speak for everybody. I'm sure people still do this, but from what I've seen, my parents were really kind of like the last generation with their parents, my grandparents, to do this idea of like a Sunday dinner, right? And it was very popular back in the day, and I got to say, never having grown up with something like that, I really kind of long for that. I really wish that was still kind of a thing. And if you have that in your family or in your neck of the woods, definitely cherish that and realize what you have, because that's a special thing to be able to, again, unwind, disconnect, but still focus a little bit of that attention towards your family life. There's something to be said around, sitting around the same table, having a shared meal. Again, probably just, unwinding from the week, sharing stories, talking about commercialism and whatnot. The NFL really capitalized on that big time as far as like NFL Sundays goes in the fall, right? Of, throwing something on the TV and saying like, well, while everybody's resting on this day of rest kind of thing, let's just throw some entertainment on there for them to watch. But again, that idea of spending time with family, maybe you do some other kind of stuff outside, like recreational type stuff, or play games or whatever. But it's really this idea of spending time with loved ones that is key here and what's most important, kind of reconnecting with them as well. There's another bullet point here that says, good deeds, maybe volunteer work or visiting the sick, helping the poor kind of thing can be done on this day as well. I don't know how much I really buy into that. I feel like even that's kind of contradictory to the whole, like, how much are you really resting if you're doing all this other stuff on a Sunday as well? Like, oh, I got to check in with my folks. I got to go to church. I got to do this. I got to do that. Like it kind of contradicts this idea of like just resting and doing nothing kind of thing. So, I maybe leave that to another day. It's not that, volunteer work and all this other kind of stuff isn't important, but maybe you don't try to cram all that stuff in on a Sunday as well. So definitely try to keep it easy on Sundays and try to rewind, relax, and reset for the week. Maybe spend some time with family and whatnot. But, again, it's this idea of trying to rest as much as possible. So I think, this is going to be, wow, a really short episode. I don't really have too much more of personal anecdotes to throw in here. I was really kind of zipping through this one this week. But, again, to recap, I think what is really important is trying to reset your mind. And when you're talking about keeping the Lord's Day holy and keeping the Sabbath holy, it's this idea of not forgetting your faith on this day. And it doesn't necessarily always equate to having to hit up church every single week. Otherwise, you're missing the mark, or coming in below the bar, so to speak. But it's this idea of making sure that you are keeping the mindset into this spiritual frame and resetting, reconnecting, and trying to unwind as much as possible. Again, I think that was a missing piece for me for quite some time. Is even before I met my wife, when I was alone or living on my own and whatnot, I was always thinking of like, what else can I do? Like, what else can I cram in? I've been, more of the creative mindset of like, what else can I do creatively? Can I, record a podcast or shoot a video, or, what else can I do in here? And it usually revolved around chores or whatever to catch up with the week, cleaning or doing stuff around the house. But it was always involved with like doing something rather than specifically trying to do nothing on that day. So I think trying to reframe it. Maybe you're having some struggles or some difficulties with this as well. Like I said, if you have some young kids running around and they each of them have different sports that they got to cram in and all this other kind of stuff. I'm not saying like don't do that or cancel all that kind of stuff, but really trying to keep at least one day in where you're just kind of like in low power mode and just trying to disconnect as much as possible. I really feel like, in this short time span that we have been trying to dedicate to sticking to this, whatever you want to call it, mantra or whatever, this idea of this day of rest, I really have seen a lot of dividends as well. I have a hectic work week schedule, maybe even more hectic than most because I have, a 3-hour commute one way. And that is, kind of killer for me as a hybrid kind of employee. So that really drains on me as well. Spending at least 6 hours in the car every single week traveling is kind of brutal. So I've really been relying on that one day to, sleep in till 10, 11 o'clock, have a late brunch kind of thing, and just, loaf around on the couch. And it really has been helping me. So, even if you don't have that kind of schedule, again, just emphasize and try to stick to and try to do it as a family as well, right? Like connect with your wife, your husband, your entire family, and just try to see if you can all get on the same page. And I don't think you'll see a lot of blowback or people disagreeing with you there on just saying like, hey fam, let's just try to take one day to do nothing. So I think you'll get a lot of enthusiastic people saying yes to that rather than more of the no camp. So again, here at the bottom of the episode here, I want to hear from you guys. What do you think about this commandment here? Have you been able to stick with it? Have you been struggling with it? I wouldn't be surprised if you haven't been able to stick with it, especially if you're American. I think a lot of other cultures, we can take a lot of a lot of the pages out of other cultures' books, so to speak, here too. You've heard of, the Mexican or the Spanish siestas. They do this in mainland Italy as well, too, where shops close for a certain number of hours. And it's really like this idea and this importance that is put on rest and, dedicating certain blocks for rest. And, this is still commonplace in a lot of places in Europe as well, where, you're going to be hard pressed to find any stores that are even open on a Sunday. And that's all done. That's all framed on purpose to kind of force you to do nothing. Like if nothing is available for you to do, you're kind of forced to do nothing, and that's on purpose. And I think that is really important. I remember I went and studied abroad when I was in college, my junior year of college, and I did go to Italy. And this is way back now, aging myself here, back in 2008. And I remember seeing that, like a lot of places were closed. They might have had like a swap meet style of thing where they had some local vendors for only like a couple hours on Sunday, like a Sunday, like late morning kind of thing, but that was it. And everything else was kind of closed down. Like you couldn't really go to restaurants, you couldn't go to supermarkets or anything, and really only like emergency type of stuff, like hospitals or whatever, would be open. And I remember looking back on that when I was a kid, going like, why would they do that? Like they could be making so much more money on Sundays and everything. And now that I'm getting older, priorities shift and everything. And I realize and I go, they're actually onto something. It actually makes a lot of sense, not from a capitalist perspective or from making money, right? If you were if you were the store vendor, then maybe you're not doing as well, from a store perspective, from your bottom line, from a net gross or whatever kind of perspective, but I think it's way more important to make sure that you're getting the rest and relaxation that you need to reset for yet another week. As I age here and slowly start slowing down, I realize and recognize the importance of that a lot more so than just trying to make an extra buck kind of thing. So, that's going to wrap it up on this one. Again, drop your comments down below. What do you think about this commandment? What do you have any other personal anecdotes, not only about this episode today, but any of the other episodes before, or just about your faith in general? If you have any general Q&A kind of stuff, drop your questions on Spotify and on the YouTube podcast section. I want to hear from you. Let's get the discussion going. Definitely need those comments to keep these episodes coming out. That's going to do it on this one. A little bit shorter of an episode this week. Don't have a teaser for the next one here, but I definitely have a lot of additional episode ideas in the bank, so don't worry about that one. And yeah, thanks so much for listening in this week, and I'll catch you on the next one.